Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Natalie LeVeck, and I'm so thrilled today to have the opportunity to interview and learn more about an incredible woman, Michèle Lamont. She just released her new book, Seeing Others: How Recognition Works and How It Can Heal a Divided World. Professor Lamont is a renowned Harvard sociologist, and her inspiring book makes a persuasive and research driven case for prioritizing recognition and respect in an equitable society. Her research involved interviewing over 180 cultural leaders across a spectrum of arenas, including Nicole Hannah Jones, Cornel West, Michael Schur, Bill Hader, and Roxane Gay, just to name a few. Before we get started, just a reminder that we will be opening things up for Q&A later on, so be sure to add your questions to the live chat on the right. So without further ado, I want to jump in, and first, let's welcome Professor Lamont.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for having me.
We are so excited that you are here. I greatly enjoyed reading your book. It led to lots of start thought. Is that a word? Thought starters. I was hoping we could begin our discussion today by laying some foundation for your book. So I was hoping you could start by walking through this idea of recognition and the 3 ways that we can build it.
Sure. Great question. So when I say recognition, one might think, oh, I recognize that this is Jim on the street, or I recognize that this is an apple. That's not what the book is about. The idea of recognition is really about seeing others as worthy and thinking about what we can do to broaden the network of people we think are worthy in our society. So one reason I focus on this in the book is, of course, the expression seeing others is so central to Gen Z and millennial culture. And I'm sure since this is Google, a lot of the listeners are millennials. So I'm sure this is speaking to them. Before writing this book, I wrote another book titled Getting Respect, which is about responses and experiences of discrimination and stigmatization in the US, Brazil, and Israel. And when we ask African American, Black Brazilians, and through 3 groups in Israel, including Ethiopian Jews, how they experience moments where they felt like they were disrespected, they mostly talk about being underestimated, being invisible, being ignored. So this experience of being seen and being viewed as valuable is really crucial to human dignity. And that's essentially what the book is about. So the last chapter of the book is really about what we can all do to broaden inclusion and to broaden, recognition for all. So the 3 approaches, one of them has to do with, instead of having one criteria of evaluation for deciding who's worthy in our society, which is in the current situation very much about having college degrees, being professionals, highly accomplished. This is great, but it leaves all the people, which is far more than 50% of the population, feeling that they're not worthy. So it doesn't work very well. So I advocate really doing a lot of things to try to maximize a plurality of criteria through which we can see people as worthy, whether it's because they're care workers, they're spiritual leaders, they're advocates, all kinds of ideas. So that's number 1. Number 2 is what I call ordinary universalism, which is really about emphasizing what we all have in common as human beings. So for one of my previous books titled The Dignity of Working Man, I did a lot of interviews with North African immigrants in France. These are people who are basically illiterate and were victim of a lot of racism. So when I interviewed them about what they think they have in common with the French people, they would say, oh, we all have 10 fingers. We all spend 9 months in our mother's womb. We all have to get up in the morning to buy bread. We're all children of God. There's good and bad people in all races. So they really focus on what we all have in common as human beings. And also when I interviewed workers in France and the US, they really emphasize a lot, treat people as people, like be egalitarian in how you relate to others. So that's basically what ordinary universalism is about, really emphasizing what we all have in common as human beings. And the third approach has to do with reducing stigma. So the point there is, if you think of same-sex marriage, or if you think of people who live with HIV/AIDS, when I came to the US in the early 80s, I was at Stanford as a postdoc. there was the AIDS crisis, and people really deeply stigmatized people with AIDS. It was viewed as the disease of basically gay men who were spending too much time in public bathrooms, having sex. So it was very morally condemned. And now it's a group that is not stigmatized at all anymore, whereas the obese were deeply stigmatized 40 years ago, and now they're not anymore. So that's about a process which sociologists like me study of reducing stigma. So the point is, if we went from a society that views same-sex marriage as abhorrent, and now it's widely accepted, by understanding how groups and behaviors have become destigmatized, it's possible to progressively move toward a society that provides recognition to a wide, larger number of peoples. So instead of thinking, oh, we just all have to be nice together and to be accepting, well, I don't think that's a solution to creating a more inclusive society. We really need to think much more in terms of what can we do to really create these broadening of recognition. And that's what the book does, basically.
Thank
A
you
long
so much.
answer.
Seeing others as worthy and valuable. I love that. I want to pivot a little bit to talk about your research. So your
Mhm.
team interviewed 180 change agents, which you can read about in the appendix because there's an amazing list. So can you help us understand your process for choosing the interviewees that you chose and what you hoped to accomplish from their participation?
Yeah. So the approach to creating change that the book favors is one that puts an emphasis on transforming narratives, transforming the stories we tell each other and we hear from the media and elsewhere about who's valuable. And this approach is important because I wrote the book in the context of, the Trump presidency, where I was
Mhm.
somewhat depressed. So I read about where do people feel hope? Where do they find hope? And the literature in the social sciences tells us it comes through narrative, through hearing alternative description of what reality is like. And therefore, it makes sense to study people whose job it is to create new narratives. And I put the project together before the pandemic, but I started really doing the interviews during the pandemic, which was a great blessing to the extent that a lot of people who are in great demand were available for interviews, and they would not have been available otherwise. So Mike Schur, for instance, the creator of Park and Recreation and The Good Place, we had a wonderful long conversation about what are the cultural changes that he's trying to implement through the narratives that he creates in his show. Same thing with Joy Soloway, who created Transparent, and they are, a gay person, and their goal was really, as they explained it to me, to make gay people and trans people less abhorrent, more understandable to the general viewer. So the show features a advanced middle-aged woman who's trans, and she has to negotiate her new identity with her adult children. And since everyone has to deal with children and try to create peace in the family, it really is a vehicle to help the reader, or the viewer rather, relate, to make these people relatable. So time and again what we learn, okay, these are the entertainers that we interviewed, but I also interviewed Heather Boucher, who's now part of the Economic Council, the Council of Economic Advisors for Biden. It includes policymakers, it includes advocates who are working on racial justice issues, incarceration policy, a very, very wide range of people. But what they all have in common is that they're producers of cultural change, and they're doing it through narrative. So the book is really, some of the key chapters are really exploring how they put these new narratives together and what they try to accomplish while doing it. So how did I find them? Well, frankly, I tried to put together, sociologists use this concept of public sphere, which is essentially where new ideas are produced and circulate. And it includes the social media, certainly, but also philanthropy, social movements. So I kind of sampled from a wide number of seeds or points of departure to try to touch the various corners of this public sphere to understand how it is done and what kind of messaging they're trying to produce. And then, we use what we call snowball sampling, where the first interviewees give you the name of next interviewees, and I mobilized a wide network of friends and colleagues to be able to reach the various people that we interviewed. So that's one of the most fun part of the book, to be able to interview all these people. Like Nicole Hannah-Jones, the book 1619 was just out, which is really revising how Americans understand the place of racism and American exceptionalism. This country became so great and so rich in part because a large proportion of the population was never paid. So to really reinvent what the history of the United States is about was a major accomplishment. And I interviewed her just basically as the book was coming out and becoming very famous. So that was very exciting. That's just one example among many. And she's a journalist at the New York Times. She had the means to really scale up this narrative so that it became so important that Trump created an alternative commission to create another vision of what American history is about. And now, of course, we have the fight in Florida with DeSantis, fighting critical race theory, which can be directly traced back to the work of this one New York Times journalist who was able to create an alliance with very important philanthropies so that this alternative understanding of American history could be diffused and scaled up extremely broadly in American society. So that's really a powerful example of a change agent who was trying to really broaden the feeling of belonging among many African Americans.
You gave some great examples there about how narratives can challenge stereotypes. I love that. I wanted to go back to what you just told us about how you decided to write this during the Trump era because you were seeking hope and you were personally depressed. In your book, you said that you saw a gap and a need for a sociologist to speak on these topics specifically during that era. Can you elaborate further on this?
Sure. So I have two colleagues here at Harvard, Steve Levitsky and Dan Ziblatt, who wrote a very important book titled How Democracy Dies. And this book went to the top of the bestseller list, the New York Times, during the Trump era. And it really used their expertise as comparative political scientists to explain how did it happen in Europe and in Latin America in the past. So understanding the past allowed us to see what was happening in the US as democracy was being attacked on several fronts. And I became the president of the American Sociological Association just when Trump became president. And right away, he did an executive order to ban travel to Muslim countries, to 7 Muslim countries. And then he attacked trans rights. I could see him, time and time again, trying to narrow the circle of who matters, who's worthy, who get recognition in American society. And as an expert, I thought, I know exactly what's happening, but the population as a whole doesn't have necessarily the tools to understand how can we fight back. And I really wanted to, it's the first trade book that I write. All my other books are more, oriented toward my peers, other experts. But this book was really, what is a narrative and why is it important and why we need to build social resilience, societies that give people the means they need to be able to fight back when things like this happen. So that was the objective of the book.
Thank you. I want to pivot a little bit and tell you that I personally was fascinated by your talk in the book about grit and resilience, and how individuals need it to act upon how there's this idea that we need grit and resilience to act upon the world through shared determination. And so I'm the daughter of 2 entrepreneurs. This is personally an idea that I was told at the dinner table, and that I've implemented in my own life. You say in your book that the solution that you propose is in contrast with this idea of grit. So can you go into that a little bit?
Well, I'm not saying people don't have grit, but I'm saying that we
Yes.
celebrate so much grit. And grit, the idea you have to pull yourself by your bootstrap and it's really all about you. The ideal of American individualism is not sufficient. I see we need to create societies that give people what can be called social resilience. Angela Duckworth, a psychologist at Penn, did a lot to popularize the notion of grit. But I think an alternative is to focus on how to create societies that give people the tools to have resilience, to live up, to their full capacity. One example is after 32 states passed same-sex marriage laws, there was a radical decline in a number of LGBTQ high school students attempting suicide. So that's an example where the implicit message of this law, which is you're worthy, you have access to the most sacred institutions of our society, was understood by them as an affirmation of their identity. It's an unintended consequence of passing the law, but it had a real impact nevertheless. So we can really think systematically about how to implement policies that do this. Think about food stamps. Earlier on, people would show up at the grocery store with a little card saying, I have food stamp, which means I'm low income, and then they would have to present it to the cashier. Well, that's deeply stigmatizing. And epidemiologists write about what we call the allostatic load, or the wear and tear of everyday life that gets under the skin and really affects deeply physical and mental health. This repeated experience of being stigmatized is absolutely terrible for people's well-being. So, if policymakers think very systematically about the messaging that comes with policies such as food stamps, it's possible to really avoid a lot of harm. So therefore, this consideration about the importance of recognition should really be part of the questions that people get trained to ask, whether they're lawyers or policymakers. Or it's an important aspect of reality that people are not necessarily fully aware of. It's not quite the same thing as discrimination.
We've been talking about American resilience, so I want to talk also about the American dream and how it has proven empty in many ways. So my question for you is, why has its influence endured, and why can't the significance of first world problems be ignored?
Yeah. So, I think the American dream is tied to American national identity. The country is founded on this idea of people coming here to seek freedom and prosperity. And generations upon generations of immigrants came to this country to embrace that dream and live that dream. And it delivered for a great many people over many, many decades. But we know that over the last 4 or 5 decades, since the mid 1980s, inequality has grown enormously in our country, and right now the majority of people, millennials, it's very hard for them to reach the same level of social status or income as their parents. So many millennials, especially since you all came on the job market around 2008 with the Great Recession, it's a generation that has not been able to buy houses. It leads many to reconsider whether they want to have children. This idea that we organize our lives around consumption and upward mobility is really appealing far less to the younger generation. So that's one reason why the dream doesn't work. The other reason, of course, is that if you have a college degree and you're a professional and manager, you're great. The whole society is celebrating you. But the rest of society that doesn't have this has really felt increasingly stigmatized and devalued. And you end up with what, economists Case and Deaton have called death by despair. They have an important book with this topic, this title. You have the opioid epidemic. You have enormous crisis of homelessness and the cities that are most unequal in our society, such as Los Angeles, New York, Philadelphia, San Francisco. So extreme wealth lives side by side with great poverty, which is terrible in terms of quality of life for all of us as a society. So we really need to revisit this. And I think the alternative is to try to define as worthy a lot of people who don't have these sacred symbols that are also constantly celebrated by television. You never have characters on entertainment television who are working class and worthy of admiration. They're always presented as stupid, like Bart Simpson, let's say. So I think that is the problem with the American dream, which is why so many alternative narratives are being proposed now. I don't think these are first world problem. These are problems for everyone. I think to tie so much our definition of who's worthy to being competitive, self-reliant, consumption, able to consume, is a problem for everyone. And I think even the cult of meritocracy can be very dangerous because it defines so many people as not worthy. Therefore, the importance of multiplying our definition of who's worthy so that it's not just so deeply tied to success.
Yeah. I'm thinking about what you said about how younger generations are increasingly rejecting this idea of the American dream. Can you share with us how is Gen Z specifically leading the way in fighting for the future and promoting inclusion over upward mobility? And
Yeah.
how can we, as non-Gen Zers, follow in their footsteps?
Yes, that's probably my most favorite part of the book. The book also has 80 interviews with college students who were in the Midwest and the East Coast. And when we interviewed them, for, of course, between the age of 18 and 22, it was the middle of the pandemic. We asked them, what are your objectives in life? What kind of society do you want to live in? And most of them really embraced the American dream, or at least embrace the idea of that you have to work and be entrepreneurial with your life to exercise agency, but at the same time they embrace something that my generation was really not attuned to, which is the therapeutic culture, the notion that you need to have a balance between life and work, and they don't want to be ambitious to the point where they lose their mind or they start being depressed. Recent studies have shown that over the last decade, the number of young college students, first year college students, experience anxiety and being overwhelmed. And that's directly tied to the parental pressure that they face about succeeding. They think that they need to succeed in order to be loved. And I think that is extremely pernicious because it doesn't allow them to develop a sense that they matter no matter what and that they are loved no matter what. So many parents are dealing with this now. But what we found in our interviews is like they braid this notion that work is important, being agentic, but also you have to have mental health care, and also work-life balance. And they also embrace this ordinary universalism, which many people have called woke culture. They will not put up with sexual harassment, they won't put up with racism, they won't put up with old men going out with young women. And this is all very healthy, I think. And finally they define themselves as a very political generation, and they are fighting climate change, and they think that the world of consumption has really destroyed our planet. So that's one more reason why they are quite critical of the American dream, because they think it's a dead end, and they want to live their best life now. And that means, if you think of the current success of the labor movement, the Starbucks workers were fighting in part to be able to put rainbow flags in the coffee shops, and the Amazon workers were fighting to be able to have restroom break, which is all about dignity, and basic human needs. So I think the labor movement is changing in really interesting ways by putting much more emphasis on recognition today than it did in the past, since so many of the workers who are mobilizing now are millennials who have participated in Black Lives Matter, are deeply committed to social justice. So I think, yes, Gen Zs are showing the way in many aspects. At the same time, my book is only considering college students. So all the Gen Zs who are not in college, those who are of working class background, I mean, this is a group that is much less, much more cynical about politics, more indifferent, or they believe in conspiracy theory. It's a group that has not been studied sufficiently to be able to be discussed by me at this point. More work needs to be done. The book in general is focused on the liberal to progressive end of the political spectrum, but there's a lot to say about the other end.
Yeah, those are some great examples of how getting people on the same page in this political landscape can ultimately impact policy. You said in your book that political or institutional reforms are not sufficient in the end to produce the change we need, because we also have to change narratives, which we've been talking about. Can you dive in further and explain this idea, why we need these narratives?
Well, if I think, since we have elections, presidential election in a year from now, one of the big challenges for the Democratic Party is to be able to continue to appeal to Gen Zs and millennials who are more progressive, while at the same time appealing to the working class. And a portion of this working class, the white working class in particular, which is nationalistic and which has often felt displaced by people of color, how is the Democratic Party going to be able to appeal to them at the same time as they don't lose young progressives? So that would be an example of, one of the big challenges for the party. And I propose in the book that this focus on dignity might be one of the ways to do it, since this is something that's not zero sum. It's not like a cake. If I get a piece, you don't get any. We can all have dignity at the same time, and the Democratic Party could certainly do much more to celebrate the dignity of workers and to give them recognition. Biden tries to do that, like with the United Automobile Workers strike. He went to the strike and he called them, you middle class people, instead of affirming them as working class. So there's really a way to challenge this equation between worth and middle class that I talked about a little bit earlier. So that's an example of, narrative change that needs to be mobilized by, in this case, the Democratic Party to position itself better for the next election.
I want to talk to something about something that is close to all of us here at Google. I feel privileged to work at an institution such as Google, where cultural policies are promoted, as are diversity programs. Can you give us some background on why these are an important ingredient to spreading recognition?
Well, I think DEI is very important. The way it's being institutionalized in most organizations is a little bit too narrow to my perspective. Too much effort has been made to diversifying the personnel by bringing in more people of color, more women. But often the people who lead these efforts are people of color themselves. And people have been denouncing the fact that this is double burden. Not only are they experiencing microaggression throughout the day in their workplace, but on top of it, they have to educate the white coworkers about, why diversity is important and how to create a more inclusive workplace. So alternative approaches, such as the work of Frank Dobbin, for instance, and Sandra Kalev, really shows that, in fact, what's important is promoting mentoring, and that all middle-level managers should be in charge of promoting diversity. It should not be the job of a few token African Americans. As for my book, it's really much more about creating a workplace where everyone feels recognized and included. So the implication for the high-tech industry, I think, are really, really important and large. And actually, this is something that I hope to work on next, to consider how recognition can be promoted in workplaces where people are mostly working with data. Because it's really one of the main things that people get from their work is the benefits of building relationships. And what happened when most of your interactions are with producing, analyzing data is a very interesting question, and how the workplace is being transformed.
Yeah, in your book, I remember that you stated that diversity remains one of the most effective approaches to forging connection between groups that are typically isolated from one another. Do you have any ideas, other than the DEI programs we just talked about how we can forge these connections and increase diversity?
Yeah, well, in general, forcing people doesn't work too much. One of the problem with these implicit association tests that many corporations are asking people to take to make them realize, oh, I'm racist. I didn't know I was racist. Well, they feel that the diversity programs are punishing, they feel denounced for being racist. So one of the things I advocate is, in the US, the local school systems are paid by local taxes. I taught at Princeton for 15 years before moving here to Cambridge. And in New Jersey, the rich school districts transfer some of their funding to the less rich school districts, so that there's less inequality across school districts, and parents who are upper middle class are less intent on simply getting their kids to go to these hyper elite upper middle class schools where they never interact with people of different social backgrounds. So the book has a section on really how parents make choices about where to send their kids to school, and how to create an environment where there's much more interaction across classes. There's a lot that we're talking about in the US about racial segregation, but the level of class segregation, the frequency at which college educated people interact with non-college educated people has increased enormously over the last decades, and most people are not aware of that, which means that people who are college educated are really losing an understanding of what the life of the low income people are like. So it's really important that we consider these things when we decide where are we going to live, which kindergarten are we going to send our kids. Is it about uh, engaging in opportunity hoarding and giving our kids all the advantages possible so that one day they can go to Harvard? Or, is it about trying to create an environment where they are exposed to a greater diversity of experiences, which might be better for them on the long term?
I want to do a quick shout out to our audience. If you have any questions for Michèle Lamont, and I'm sure you all do, please put them in the comment chat box and we will be answering them shortly. One more for you. What do you see as the troublesome blind spots of economists and behavioral scientists who are also oftentimes weighing in on these issues?
Yes. Well, I like this question. I mean, economists have done amazingly important work to understand inequality. My colleague Rash Chetty, for instance, or Thomas Piketty have done very important work to show how much economic inequality has grown. What they don't see is like inequality is of course produced. Distribution of resources is crucial to inequality, but inequality is not only made of resources, it's also made of status and who is defined as worthy. So in some of my previous papers, I argued that to fully understand inequality, you have to look at recognition and distribution together. So it's not the politics of identity versus, the politics of giving people resources. These two things really need to go hand in hand, in part because we all know now. There's a new book that just came out, The Science of Dignity, that shows that, affirming your dignity is central to well-being for all human beings, as much as actually the accumulation of resources. So that would be the main blind spot for economists. It's not the blind spot. It's more that they specialize in what they do, but there are aspects of reality that they're just not equipped to study. And that's why you need the other social sciences, especially sociology and psychology. The other aspect that as for behavioral psychologists, I mean, they have brought us the nudging industry, and the idea that we are wired to do X or Y. And the problem with nudging, it's like stimulus response. It's like if we're Pavlovian dogs. You give us a stimulus and we respond. In fact, people interpret their life in the context of meaning making that is produced collectively, and they really tend to downplay that and to really ignore like narratives. Some psychologists do, but the current wave of research for the last 20 years in psychology has very much been focused on nudging, which I think is really ignorant. That's why we need to focus on the stories that we tell each other and how we interpret our reality. So it's a difference in terms of methodology, but also in terms of emphasis and how we understand what drives people. In psychology, you've also had a lot of emphasis on tribalism. So the assumption here is that we are wired to like people who are part of our group and want to always maximize the status of our group. Well, in fact, historically, that has changed a lot. There's some groups that have more groupness or more sense of collective interest than others. And there's a number of factors that determine this. So a lot of the background work on human nature, I think, presumes a kind of ahistoricism that doesn't. I think a lot of research contradicts what the basic assumption of that work.
As a quick follow-up, you talked about social factors that drive this groupness. What are some of those social factors?
That's a complicated question. So in the book, Getting Respect, that I started with on racism in the US, Brazil, and Israel, we explained that in the US, we did 120 interviews, I think, with African Americans about their experience with racism and what are their responses. The main response for all African American is you have to confront racism. You have no choice. And then we discuss all the factors that explain why this is the predominant response in the US, which includes, of course, the civil rights movement, the civil rights legislation, which enables people to do this and say, this is what it's the legitimate response. And African Americans have a very strong level of groupness. They have a strong level of collective consciousness and awareness and their history and what they share together. You compare that to Black Brazilians, where it's the majority population, but they've experienced a lot of racism and discrimination, but they're always confused about, is it because they think I'm poor because I'm Black, or is it because of racism? So they're far less likely to want to confront. And that has to do also with their American dream is this notion of racial democracy, which advocates that we should all just, get along and love each other. And so there's a number of factors. I'm not going to go on and on, but that explains why Black Brazilians have much less groupness. In the Israel case, we interviewed Mizrahim, who are Oriental Jews, and Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as Ethiopian Jews. So we have Black people in the three societies, and both the Mizrahim especially, they are totally at the bottom of the labor market, just as African Americans are in the US. And they know that they're deeply discriminated against, because they come from the Iran and Iraq and countries that are viewed as less modern and less developed, but they say it's okay because we're Jewish and we're in a society of Jewish people. It's ethno nationalism, and they're in. At the same time, they experience nonstop this discrimination, but they don't confront. And when we did interviews for that book, which was in the mid 80s, Ethiopian Jews were not confronting very much either, in part because they were immigrants. So these are all examples of what is the modal response and what are the historical conditions that explains very different approaches to addressing racism across societies. So that's just one example among others.
I want to jump to a question we received from Simone FN. The question is, hi, Michèle, did you have any surprising findings while writing this book?
Oh, that's a good question. So many. When you write a book, it's a big adventure because you come in with an idea, with some inklings of what you're going to find. One example, there's 75 interviews with Hollywood producers and stand-up comics. And we did with two graduate students an extremely detailed analysis of what they did to engage in recognition. So one of the strategies that we identified is what we call the Trojan horse. So I interviewed Camel Bell, very influential African-American comic who's married with a white woman, and he's a middle-class Black comedian. And he says that his job is to kind of interpret Black America for white middle-class people. And he talks about, we developed a typology of these approaches that the stand-up comic use in their work to create recognition. And one of them is what we call the Trojan horse approach, which is to say, we're not going to force people to eat their vegetables. We're there to make them laugh. But at the same time, a lot of their work as they're telling their jokes is to broaden recognition, to make, white people aware of racism or transphobia, to make fun of people who are transphobic. So those are just two examples, but they've developed a really extensive ways to try to promote recognition through humor, which is really, really remarkable and a great, really fun part of the book. I really enjoy doing that.
Definitely. So, Professor Lamont, we will make sure that everyone knows how to buy your book and how to stay connected with you. Is there any final takeaway that you want to leave us with as we wrap up this event?
Well, I think millennials, I know most of the employees at Google are millennials, and I think, really play a really crucial role in trying to create a different society. I have a friend who's a millennial who works at Google, and he lives here in Boston, and he's there's a direct budgeting committee in the little town where he lives. Somerville, and he's involved in this, and his partner is involved in community gardening. You know, I think these are examples of how millennials at the ground level are really trying to create a different world. And I think people are choosing to do this every day in how they decide to spend their lives. So I would say, go millennials. I think, creating a new society every day, and the choices we made is really the way to go about it. So that would be my parting message, I think.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you for coming to Talks at Google, and thank you for our audience for staying tuned. Again, the book is called Seeing Others. I'm not great with my camera. I hope you will all check it out and be inspired to go into the world and effectuate change. Professor Lamont, we hope you will stop by again. Thank you so much. And to the audience, thank you for tuning in.
And thank you so much, Natalie, for your great questions.
You're so welcome.